This video is sponsored by HelloFresh. I will never again reach the level of discipline that I imposed on myself as a teenager in art school. With my ambitions high and my childhood optimism living out its final days, I spent my 4 years as a drama major tirelessly honing my craft. I scoffed at my ambivalent peers and sobbed in the bathroom when I didn't land a role. Whenever I cried at home, I would stand in front of the mirror and recite my favorite monologue. From my earliest days at the school, I came to understand art as the chronic opening of an unhealed wound. My intensity was in part a manifestation of my own teenage desire for validation and respect, but it was also in part a product of the trauma-reward feedback loop that permeated the culture of my school. In grade 9, I performed a slice-of-life monologue based on a girl I had observed at the mall, and delivered my final lines through shaking sobs. I finished to rapturous applause with no memory of the performance, and felt euphoric. In grade 11, we were asked to submit a diary entry about a secret we had been keeping. I wrote about my depression and the feeling of being chained to the bottom of my own mind. My teacher later told me she read it to her senior class as an exemplary submission. This made me feel important. In grade 12, my creative writing teacher asked us to pen a personal anecdote about our lives and present it out loud to our peers. Most people cried during their presentations, and with the guide of our teacher, the class would sigh in collective catharsis. I wrote about how proud I was of my dad, and ended the presentation, again, in tears. I wanted to prove that I was serious about writing. It was the only A I received in that course from a teacher who otherwise took little interest in me. I wouldn't trade my time at that school for anything. While many have gone on to bemoan their experiences there, I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to explore an art without real-world constraints. My adult years were a difficult adjustment because I lost my creative outlet. Acting had been a form of what I felt to be therapy, a place where I could tear open my heart and receive praise for it. But over the past couple years, through self-reflection and conversations with friends, I've come to terms with how exploitative the culture of our school could sometimes be, how prejudices crept up through the institution and disadvantaged certain students, how some teachers sapped from our young traumas and used them in their quest to find validation and respect in their own lives and careers. The culture of my high school did not exist in a vacuum. The discomfiting and spectacular mixture of art and pain is something that's long been venerated in Western society. From Van Gogh to Kahlo to Hemingway, we tend to understand art as this great release and expression of pain, an exorcism of inner demons turned into a magnum opus for reverent beholders. The painless. I think the most insidious and mainstream version of this duality in art comes around awards season. You know, when the media outlets start spinning stories about the ridiculous process that an actor underwent to prepare for a role, and then we all kind of laugh about it, and we're like, they must have really wanted that Oscar. You've heard it before. He lost himself in that role. Or as the saying goes, he went method. The method, which is an acting technique that's popularly understood as an actor's total personal devotion to a character, is one of the most simultaneously beloved and maligned practices of the acting world. In popular culture, it's almost commonplace to associate the method with good acting. But no one can really agree upon what the method really is. At this rate, anything from just researching a role to needing therapy to get out of a role is considered method. You've seen the listicles. 5 method actors who almost died for a role. 10 times method acting went too far. And the list includes Natalie Portman learning ballet, intermingled with Daniel Day-Lewis catching pneumonia for refusing to wear a contemporary winter coat on the set of Gangs of New York. It's gotten to the point where we've stopped questioning why we think the method is good, which has culminated in a pretty destructive culture for the world of film acting. Maybe it's time someone deigns to say it. Or maybe it's time I deign to say it. Method acting does not necessarily a great actor make. These days, it kinda goes without saying that acting requires some degree of empathy with a character. But this concept wasn't always a linchpin of the craft. Actually, it was brought about in the late 19th century by theater practitioner Konstantin Stanislavski. In his observations of theater rehearsals, Stanislavski found Russian stage acting at this time to be stilted and dispassionate. Describing one rehearsal, he wrote, "The director sat on the forestage and gave his instructions to the cast. 'What should I do here?' asked one actor. 'Sit on the sofa,' the director answers. 'And what should I be doing?' asks another. 'You are nervous. Wring your hands and walk up and down,' the director orders. 'Can't I sit down?' the actor persists. 'How can you possibly sit down when you are nervous?' replies the bewildered director. Stanislavski identified that a truly believable performance requires a degree of realism, which is impossible when an actor's every move is micromanaged by a director. So he developed a praxis for actors that would allow them to conjure up organic emotions and movements on stage. He called this praxis the system. Building upon Russian theatrical realism brought about in the earlier 19th century by actors like Mikhail Shchepkin, he sought to create a grammar of acting, a basic set of techniques and exercises that would allow the actor to develop an inner life rather than just imitating external life. This process would allow an actor to breathe life into their character and react organically in the moment to their scene partners. Over the years, Stanislavski constantly reworked and built upon his ideas, acknowledging that the craft of acting can never be confined to a set of immutable rules. But since his ideas were changing so frequently by the end of his life, they were widely misinterpreted as they traveled overseas. The system was originally taken to the West by actors from the Moscow Art Theater, but by the time it got there, it had already been updated multiple times over. Perhaps the most prominent pupil to bring Stanislavski's ideas to the US was Richard Boleslavsky, a mentor to a number of the people who would go on to invent the method, most prominently Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg. In 1931, these two, along with Harold Clurman and Cheryl Crawford, founded a revolutionary New York City-based theater collective called the Group Theater, later evolving into the Actors Studio, which is still in operation today under the purview of Alec Baldwin, Ellen Burstyn, and Al Pacino. Now, it's important to note that Stanislavski's system was equal parts internal and external, with the external emphasizing things like relaxation, vocal techniques, and physical expressiveness. And it was these aspects of his teachings that would be muddied once they reached the US. What did carry over were the internal aspects, most notably the practice of emotion memory. Not every founder of the method relied solely on this practice. Stella Adler famously leaned more heavily into the physical aspects of Stanislavski's work, whereas Lee Strasberg was almost puritanical in his insistence on the psychological. This would cause a massive schism between Adler, who was reverent towards Stanislavski, and Strasberg, who, upon meeting Stanislavski, showed very little respect for his work. According to Stella Adler, Strasberg said, "We do it better than you." He was a man of great arrogance. Basically, the Strasbergian method, iterations of which you see making headlines today, is a distortion of Stanislavski's theory of emotion memory. Stanislavski's early usage of the system was created to teach lesser-known actors how to act, and it partially relied on a technique where an actor draws from their personal reservoir of memories to lend a bit of human truth to a performance. But this was quickly dropped by Stanislavski because he viewed it only as a last resort and found that his students who were employing it too heavily were experiencing mental problems. As Jean Benedetti explains in his comprehensive history of Stanislavski, in reading a play, an actor is called on to fill it out with his own memories and experiences, to give it human depth by his own personal involvement through emotion memory. All too often, however, the evocation of past experiences produced negative results: tension, exhaustion, sometimes hysteria. At other times, the mind seized up, refusing to yield up its secrets. Stanislavski had always been aware of how carefully the evocation of emotion had to be handled. The unconscious cannot be commanded. Feelings have to be lured, enticed. Now it seemed to him that any kind of direct attempt to evoke feeling or the memory of feeling had to be avoided. Just as it was wrong for an actor to be assaulted by a battery of outside fact and knowledge, so it was wrong for him to assault his own emotions. So you can see how Stanislavski was already worried about the implications that this practice would have for the actor and the people around them. Luckily, Strasberg made an entire career out of it. Strasberg's version of the system, which he called the method, is essentially a series of exercises born out of emotion memory. He called it emotional recall, where an actor literally recalls a memory that happened 7 years or more before the time of performance and uses it to feel the emotions of a character. They were also pushed to live and breathe that character, and to write out full biographies of the character's life before and after the given circumstances of a scene. For Strasberg, it was all about producing consistent performances and heightening the actor's awareness of self. This was also around the time that the ideas of Sigmund Freud and psychotherapy were entering the American public vernacular. According to Scott Balcerzak, reborn in an era of increased psychotherapy, Strasberg's focus on sense and affective memory was Stanislavski narrowed down to a quasi-Freudian inner working fueled by an obsession with the self. Where Stanislavski's system was created for burgeoning or amateur actors, Strasberg's was developed with big stars in mind. For example, when Stella Adler's muse Marlon Brando came to prominence for his groundbreaking performance in A Streetcar Named Desire,
Hey, Stella!
Strasberg took credit for it. While Strasberg's iteration of the method is commonly used in Hollywood today, it's pretty maligned in the world of theater academia. Of course, I'm no professional, nor did I attend post-secondary acting school, so I brought in my friend Ellie to give her perspective on the method and how it's received in theater academia. Ellie's been acting in the film industry since she was 8, and she attended Canada's prestigious National Theatre School. She also attended high school with me, and I can definitely say she was one of the best actors in her year, if not the best.
What was great about NTS, I found, was that there was this emphasis on exposing students to like a variety of different methods and pedagogies and genres, and pieces of art from various countries and eras. So there really isn't this one method that the school subscribes to and delivers to their students. Really, I think the overall pedagogy is like variety of exposure. I think honestly, the most like concrete and useful tools that I got from school were related to script work, and were related to like analyzing text and story. And that's actually served me best in my career so far in the realm of like the industry of working actors, people who go between film and television and theater, and just are kind of your regular day-to-day Canadian working actors. This concept of method acting is not really something that is a very practical part of anyone's process. It's just not realistic. Mm-hmm. The budgets aren't high enough. You're not famous enough to get away with some of the stuff that is typically practiced in method acting. Like, it's just not something that plays into a practical working actor life, like, at all, really. Mm-hmm. I really feel like I do my best acting work when my personal life is very stable and very consistent. And something I've always felt is that I'm able to experiment and do the most extreme things in my art when I'm the most stable internally and know that I have something to come back to, like safe. And I found that in projects and doing plays and film, like if I feel safe in an environment too, then I'm able to do way more interesting stuff. I'm able to go places with my imagination that are much darker, actually, because it allows me to risk more, because I know that right. I have some stability to return to.
In his book, succinctly called Acting, John Harrop, like Ellie, takes a pretty critical position on the method. He says, "Emotion memory is essentially secondhand. It uses emotion that is stimulated by a circumstance other than that of the play's immediate action. It introduces an emotional non sequitur into a performance. It can produce irrelevance. The actor is involved with a past situation of his or her own, rather than responding to the action of the present." He goes on to say, "The creation of biographies can weigh the actor down with all manner of irrelevancies and lead to spending performance time filling out the life of the character rather than energetically pursuing the character's action as given in the script." For a lot of critics, Strasberg's method does almost the exact opposite of what Stanislavski set out to do. Rather than allowing the actor to live in the moment and fully embody the character, it takes them right out of a scene and into their own heads, bogging them down with the details of their own selfhood. As Karen Hollinger points out, the method arguably created an acting style that largely celebrated the neuroses of the individual performer, fed the star system by its strong emphasis on the actor's personality, and created a cult-like atmosphere of director worship by its idolization of Strasberg. Which brings me to my next section. Although award ceremonies really add a level of glitz and glam to the business, you might be surprised to know that film hasn't always had the prestige that it does today. Actually, in its earlier years, it was considered low culture. As Cynthia Barron and Sharon Marie Carnicke state, live stage performance has been associated with legitimacy, complexity, and authenticity, while screen performance has often been viewed as something other than true acting. Theater actors had only their skills and the momentum of a scene to rely on, whereas film actors had the help of lighting, framing, and editing. They had multiple tries to get it right, and a director who could instruct them at every turn. And to a degree it's true, stage and screen acting are super different. On stage, every moment is informed by the one that came before it. You're living the scene and bouncing off the energy of your scene partners. But with film, oftentimes you're isolated on camera and forced to conjure up the moment only after someone yells action. So you can see why screen actors were so allured by the method. Strasberg promised that you could replicate and turn on a single emotion again and again and again for each take.
In film, sometimes you're shooting things out of sequence. The day is like broken up. Sometimes you'll have to shoot your close-up and the person that you're reacting to actually leaves set and isn't even there, so you don't have them to react to. In those situations, I do understand why you and I've used them myself, this concept of substitution, where you would use a memory or an emotional recall from your personal life because you just need to get to an emotional place so that the story is clear. And you have a direction and something is written into the script and you need to achieve it and you've got 2 takes to do it, and you will just have to bring that up and make it happen. And it's very results based. So in those instances, I do understand.
Acting, unlike painting or dancing, is an intangible art form. An actor can spend years honing their skill and still struggle to convey a particular emotion or empathize with a particular character. The value we place on acting is measured mostly through archaic institutions like the Motion Picture Academy, which offers a very constrained view on what good acting looks like. It's for this reason that actors feel compelled to prove to their audience that they've put themselves through something in dedication to their craft. This isn't a new concept. Art and suffering have always operated in tandem with each other. Kurt Cobain was suffocated by his depression, but he created transformative music. Billie Holiday lived a very troubled life of abject poverty and abuse, but the pain in her voice when she sings Solitude is immeasurable and moving. Francisco de Goya also suffered chronically from deteriorating mental health, but he left us with some of the most haunting masterpieces in the Western canon. It's dangerous to venerate art as this transaction in exchange for a creator's well-being, but that's how we've chosen to value creativity. For centuries, we've bestowed importance on art by mythologizing the process through which it was created, and we love to mythologize suffering. The Venn diagram of talent, genius, creativity, pain, and insanity is as old as time. In the Ion, Plato's Socrates says, "For the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired and is out of his senses, and the mind is no longer with him. When he has not attained to this state, he is powerless and is unable to utter his oracles." Here, he speaks of creativity as a divine thing born out of madness. What makes the method feel a bit perverse is that it's become a sort of rulebook for the actor to facilitate their own suffering, like a repertoire of painful memories that can be accessed at any time. I don't think any art should be measured or venerated based on how much an artist has suffered in their life. And I definitely don't think any artist should be trained to self-impose that suffering or turn it on and off like a switch. Gary Oldman, for example, who's one of the most renowned actors of our time, used to talk about carrying around a pain bag with him to set, which held a bunch of memorabilia that conjured up terrible memories. When an interviewer in a 2012 article for GQ questioned him on this and asked, "Because everyone likes a tormented actor?" he said, "You've got to be kind of crazy, haven't you?" I played it up a bit. Method acting has become a ritual for bearing the scars of self-imposed suffering in the name of art, or at least boasting about it. It's a means of bestowing legitimacy on an underappreciated art form. An art form that some have characterized as sissy. Now you're a man! A man, man, man! Now you're a man! A mounty, mounty, mount, a man, man, man! You are now a man, you're a man! Now you're a man! 2016 was a bit of an embarrassing year for the legacy of method acting. In an attempt to give weight to his doomed performance as the Joker in Suicide Squad, Jared Leto had reportedly sent his co-stars an array of gifts that ranged from condoms to a live rat to a dead pig. He also spent time on the dark web watching grisly crime footage. The director, David Ayer, was nothing short of reverent towards Leto's antics. The Joker is something you have to be, and you can see how exhausting and painful it is for him to be this character. Yet the only pain experienced here was by his disgruntled co-stars and audiences who had to sit through Leto's mediocre performance. But not all performances that year were bad. It was the year Leonardo DiCaprio won a long-awaited Oscar for The Revenant, but this also came with its own ridiculous stories during awards season. The buzz was that Leo, a longtime vegetarian, had apparently eaten raw bison in preparation for his role as frontiersman Hugh Glass. He also put himself through freezing temperatures under the threat of hypothermia and opted to sleep in an animal carcass.
You know, there's a lot of things that I do in this movie, whether it be sleeping in an animal carcass or falling off of cliffs or going down frozen roaring rapids or fighting with Tom Hardy or a bear, for example. I mean, you name it.
So just, give him the fucking Oscar or something. I don't know. Both Leto and Leo's desperate antics, well, particularly embarrassing, fall into a long tradition of male method actors attempting to mythologize themselves in pursuit of prestige. The litany of stories about these guys doing weird stuff on set is endless. Daniel Day-Lewis gets pneumonia in prepper gangs of New York, builds a house 17th century style and refuses to shower for The Crucible, stays in character as Abraham Lincoln for the 7 months it took to film Lincoln, and uses a wheelchair demanding to be spoon-fed for My Left Foot. Tom Hanks refuses to shower and gets a staph infection for Castaway, and also yells in character as a prison guard at Stephen King on the set of The Green Mile. Leonardo DiCaprio cuts his hand slamming a glass in Django Unchained and wipes his blood on Kerry Washington's face. This take is in the movie. Al Pacino poses as a cop and threatens to arrest a truck driver for Serpico and acts blind on the set of Scent of a Woman by stumbling over things and refusing to look his co-stars in the eye while cameras weren't rolling. Johnny Depp lives in Hunter S. Thompson's basement and smokes next to gun barrels for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Nicolas Cage eats a cockroach for A Vampire's Kiss and pulls out his own teeth for Birdie. Gary Oldman smokes $30,000 worth of cigars for Darkest Hour and develops stomach issues from it. Jared Leto lives on the streets for Requiem for a Dream and gives himself gout for Chapter 27. Shia LaBeouf drops acid for Charlie Countryman, stays drunk on moonshine for Lawless, submits a personal sex tape as his audition for Nymphomaniac, and refuses to shower for Fury, which grosses out Brad Pitt. Edward Norton punches Brad Pitt for Fight Club. Sean Penn just straight up assaults John Leguizamo on camera for Casualties of War. Dustin Hoffman makes fun of Meryl Streep's recently deceased boyfriend, John Cazale, and slaps her in the face for Kramer vs. Kramer, and then doesn't sleep for 72 hours for Marathon Man, which earns him a well-deserved roasting by acting vet Laurence Olivier, who allegedly asked him, "My dear boy, why don't you just try acting? It's so much easier." What you'll notice on any famous method acting list is that the actors from Hollywood are overwhelmingly white men. Non-white actors who do make it into the canon, like Dilip Kumar or Choi Min-sik, are typically not from Hollywood. Ironically, the black actors from Hollywood who do make it to the lists are 2 of a mere 4 black men to win an Oscar for a leading role. Forrest Whitaker pops up now and again because he gained 30 pounds and learned to speak Swahili when he played Idi Amin in The Last King of Scotland, for which he won his Oscar. Jamie Foxx had to receive therapy after diving too deep into a role for The Soloist and glued his eyes shut during the filming of Ray, a role for which he again won his Oscar. I can't say that Forrest Whitaker gaining weight and doing preliminary research necessarily qualifies as going method, but you can see how he and Jamie Foxx's acting processes were mythologized once they were formally recognized by the institution. Whitaker and Foxx continue to stand out starkly against their white male counterparts. This also isn't to say that female actors or BIPOC female actors haven't ascribed to the method or studied under its mentors. It's more so that its legacy has passed through the hands of white cis men. This might be because the method is rooted in the ideals of American individualism and brooch masculinity. Beginning with Marlon Brando's rugged sexuality and latent, almost explosive working-class machismo in A Streetcar Named Desire, followed by James Dean's tortured and brooding portrayals in Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden, it was clear that a new type of mid-century masculinity was taking over Hollywood. And with their acclaim, Brando and Dean, both of whom were method actors, helped to bring the method to mainstream attention. As Hollander states, the method early became associated with male rebel heroes whose antisocial behavior, inner disturbance, emotional repression, and personal anguish came to be seen as authentic and distinctly masculine. People like Brando, Dean, and Montgomery Clift exuded a type of masculinity that was complicated and sexually potent. Or in the words of Hollinger, they exuded a tension between an outer mask of stoic strength and self-control and an inner emotional core constantly on the verge of breaking through in the form of violent outburst. They paved the way for later method actors like Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, and Jack Nicholson, all of whom are still some of the most renowned actors in Hollywood, and all of whom were known for portraying brooding, repressed, and/or latently masculine characters. But while their on-screen performances are legendary, their off-screen antics reveal the true tension of acting, that is, the tension between job and art. The beauty of stage performance is in its communality. Everyone is working together to create this transcendent experience with an art form. Stanislavski understood this. The actor's expression of their inner self would allow them to move comfortably about the stage and engage organically with their scene partners. But the method, with its decidedly masculine sensibility, is bound to the ideals of American individualism. The actor is priority above all else. Screen acting may be more isolated and mediated than stage acting, but it's still a group effort. Hundreds and hundreds of people surround the actors, working together to make them look good, to make their own version of transcendent art. Is Dustin Hoffman thinking of his scene partner Meryl Streep when he allegedly took out his angst against his own ex-wife by making jeers about John Cazale's death? Was Leo thinking about Kerry Washington when he wiped his own fluids on her face? Or was Jim Carrey thinking of the people working tirelessly on Man on the Moon when he berated and harassed them on set, claiming to be possessed by Andy Kaufman? The method, when it's employed by male stars in their desperation to self-mythologize, becomes a cult of the individual actor. As Harrop reflects, this was not what Stanislavski had in mind when calling for a greater concern with inner process, but it was splendidly consonant with the idea that the concerns of the individual in society are primary, and what is most real and interesting about the individual is his or her personal feelings. Not only does Strasberg's insistence on mind over body prioritize the self of the actor, it also served as an American rejection of Stanislavski's ethos. Its peddling of rugged individualism and self-worship was a way for male actors to justify their choice of a sissy career. What better way to show the non-believers that my job is in fact not sissy than to treat my self-imposed brute labor like a rite of passage? Christian Bale rejects his sissy image by attempting to demonstrate startling control over his body, jumping from emaciated to muscly to portly in the blink of an eye. Jim Carrey convinces us of his devotion to acting by swearing he was possessed by Andy Kaufman, relinquishing control of his actions in a touch of divine madness. Leo isn't a pretty boy anymore because he gave himself hypothermia for no reason. In a scathing 2016 article for The Atlantic, Angelica Jade Bastién says, "By going method, a performer can signal that he works for his art. He can make his labor visible." She compares the ways that actors like Leonardo DiCaprio are discussed versus an actor like Brad Pitt. In the 90s, both Leo and Pitt were considered golden boys, the certifiable dreamboats of Hollywood. But Leo was able to diverge from this title when he started going method, proving to audiences and critics that he was a real actor. Pitt, on the other hand, who delivers equally impressive performances, has seldom gained the same level of reverence. Bastién says, "Pitt isn't often praised as a great actor, and it's not because he doesn't have the scenes to prove it. Rather, he has an ease and ability to use his personality to inform his work in a way that recalls the greats of classic Hollywood like Cary Grant, who didn't believe acting needed to be a painfully realistic reflection of the world." Personally, I found Leo's later performances to be a bit overwrought and predictable. Brad Pitt, on the other hand, always manages to surprise me with his command over text and his subtle shifts in persona. But that's just me. So if the method has become something that's championed by male actors, what does it look like when it's employed by female method actors, or when a regular female actor comes into contact with it? We can trace the patriarchal roots of the method all the way back to Stanislavski himself, who, while being progressive in many senses of the word, also carried with him the misogynistic values of his time. In her book, Stanislavski in Focus, Sharon Marie Carnicke makes note of the way he approached women under his tutelage. She observes, "When he catches his class taking his advice about truth and logical behavior too far, he makes an example of women. To prove that too hearty a demand for truthful actions can be detrimental, he asks them to walk up and down the hall, faulting their every move, calling each step false, until they collapse in tears. When he describes how the use of a personal emotion on the stage can be harmful to the psyche of an actor, he chooses a woman's memory to explore. His women students often cry, flirt, show off on stage, respond best to scenes that feature maternal love. In short, they are drawn from stereotypical images. In an early feminist critique of the method called The Female Actor Prepares, Linda Walsh Jenkins and Susan Ogden Malouf raise a similar concern about stereotyping, noting, "When the roles in which people believe, the ways in which they are taught belief, and the process by which they rehearse belief are closed to gender consciousness and commentary, the situation is unhealthy." They then take the argument further by saying, "The acting coach or director frequently serves as an all-knowing guru for whom the performer must be absolutely vulnerable, opening the way to both psychological and sexual exploitation." It's common in method acting for a female actor to be the muse of some greater mind. Marilyn Monroe was incredibly close with Lee Strasberg when she sought to be taken more seriously as an actress. In a 2003 memoir about Lee and Marilyn's relationship, journalist and actress Patricia Bosworth recounted, "Marilyn would take the elevator to Lee's, where he would guide her in a series of sense memory exercises, in which she acted like a child in an effort to get in touch with her real self, her real tragic power. 'Do this exercise and you'll feel something,' he would tell Marilyn. And she believed him because she needed to, for Marilyn Monroe was not often in touch with how she felt. She would struggle mightily to release emotional and physical blocks as she recalled one of her most disturbing childhood memories, the time a relative tried to suffocate her with a pillow. But the pain of recalling those early years as Norma Jean Baker, the abandoned and abused child, was excruciating. Marilyn confided to Susan Strasberg that occasionally, when Lee's questions became too probing, she would just make something up. In Bosworth's eyes, Lee offered Marilyn respect as an actress, and she offered him a ticket to fame and celebrity. She's careful to note, though, that Strasberg and his wife Paula also held Marilyn back in many ways. She says, "Marilyn never lost her terror of being on a movie set because Paula continually forced her to reach down for her real self. In Monroe's case, that meant not only Norma Jean, the abused orphan child, but also Marilyn, the blonde wiggly sex symbol." Lee's relationship to her was less so of an acting mentor than a father figure to someone who was clearly stunted by childhood trauma. He took on the role all too willingly, drawing from her trauma to make a name for himself out of his proximity to her. Men have often positioned themselves as gurus of the method, attempting to wean good performances out of women. Otto Preminger tormented Jean Seberg during their brief working relationship, and allowed her to be burned by fire during the execution scene in St. Joan. The take of her yelling in real anguish was left in the film. Alfred Hitchcock frequently terrorized Tippi Hedren while filming The Birds, as did Stanley Kubrick with Shelley Duvall on the set of The Shining. Perhaps most deplorable was when Bernardo Bertolucci and Marlon Brando conspired to withhold from 19-year-old Maria Schneider that they would be using butter on her during the rape scene in Last Tango in Paris. The sexual humiliation that Schneider felt during this moment, and in the years after the film's release, would have a devastating impact on her life. Bertolucci maintained until he died that the information was withheld to get a more realistic reaction from Schneider. All of these moments demonstrate the shadow that method acting has cast over the film industry. Whether or not these directors or mentors even ascribed to the method isn't the point. The point is that the industry's dogged commitment to realism led to a mistrust in the talent of actors, particularly women, and it gave way to outright abuse in the name of art. The non-method acting woman's body became a conduit for the guru's ego and even his own twisted sexual fantasies. None of the female actors I've mentioned so far, aside from Marilyn, considered themselves method actors. But there are actually quite a number of female actors who did ascribe to it. Jane Fonda, Ellen Burstyn, Kim Hunter, Geraldine Page, Anne Bancroft, Joanne Woodward, Scarlett Johansson, and Laura Dern, to name a few, all studied the method. But you rarely hear about them terrorizing co-stars or crew members. There's really no mythology around them at all, they just do the job. When a woman does make it to the method acting has gone too far lists, it's usually about a drastic change in her physical appearance rather than her on and off set behavior. Charlize Theron looks so much uglier in Monster. Hilary Swank bound her chest and cut her hair for Boys Don't Cry. Actually, some of the most acclaimed female actors of the 20th and 21st centuries don't associate themselves with the method at all.
You just can't go, on the set and just go, okay, I'm gonna go hog wild because the character is going wild. He just punches a wall in with his bare fist, so I'm gonna do it. And then walk away with broken fingers. I don't want broken fingers. I just want to show you that it looks like I'm breaking my fingers. So it's technique, craft is what allows me to leave it behind and go home to my husband and my child.
Jodie Foster famously rejects it, saying, "If anything, what I do is by instinct. My method is just do what I think is right. I don't think you have to feel the character and research it for years. Maybe I would do research if I were playing Henry VIII, but otherwise, no. Meryl Streep says she doesn't understand the method, but instead brings her own process to each role. She says, "Always work from the inside. You always connect with a piece of material from the inside, or you shouldn't do it. You always work from the inside out, and then you take care of the outside business." Actually, when asked about Meryl's own behavior on the set of Kramer vs. Kramer, the director Robert Benton said, "I never saw one moment of emotion leak out of her except in performance." Typically, you'll find that female actors step out of their roles once the director yells cut. Bastién speaks a bit to this. Modern actresses have to contend with sexist casting couch horror stories, being paid far less than their male co-stars, and a myriad of other issues, which gives even the most powerful amongst them a precarious foothold in Hollywood. With the odds already stacked against her in so many ways, an actress can wisely assume that sending her castmates dead animals might be the end of her career. This goes double and triple for BIPOC actors whose spaces in the industry are so limited already, especially in mid-century Hollywood. Strasberg's method extends to an actor insofar as the specter of total ruin and black sheeping isn't hanging over their heads at every given moment.
I've never gone full method because, to Jay Ellis's brilliant point, you kind of can't.
Right.
So I'm like, wherever Tom Hardy and Leo DiCaprio have gone, or Ryan Gosling or Chris Pine, or Daniel Day-Lewis, the god of method, I've never really fully gone there because of your great question of like, well, I don't want to be pulled over for driving while method. Right. Not fully method. I get in trouble for that. That's scarier.
Right.
So if I'm 1/4 method, sometimes they're like, Amari. I'm like, guys, I'm here. I still go home to Jay and the kids. I'm not fully method.
Right.
Wow.
Until you have that leverage to go fully method, which perhaps we're all searching for.
What was once a cutting-edge practice of acting is now the standard by which we judge major players in the film industry. The method, or its foundational logic, runs so deeply through archaic Hollywood institutions that it's stretched across gendered and racial lines. While the group theater and the actor's studio may have started out with pure intentions of innovating the art of acting, people like Strasberg allowed their own ambition and pride to distort Stanislavski's work for the worst, as well as exacerbate the patriarchal undertones baked into it. His navel-gazing pursuit of celebrity gave birth to generations of male actors whose religious devotion to their art, an art form which some of them simultaneously consider lesser than themselves, has led to sanctioned abuse within the film industry. It's time we find a way forward that doesn't allow the male ego to define prestige. Rather than the method, we can embrace a multiplicity of methods. What about anti-realist styles of acting that you can find in the works of auteurs like David Mamet, Spike Lee, or Baz Luhrmann? Great acting doesn't need to be defined by archaic institutions or self-mythologizing. What makes a great performance is in the eyes of the audience and the performer themselves. We need to trust acting as an art form and find beauty in the many ways it can be mastered. As esteemed theater practitioner Uta Hagen once wrote, "The actor must know that since he himself is the instrument, he must play on it to serve the character with the same effortless dexterity with which the violinist makes music on his. Just because he doesn't look like a violin is no reason to assume his techniques should be thought of as less difficult."
If you're using techniques that are ultimately kind of damaging psychologically, your career could really be like cut short because you don't have this like emotional endurance to sustain working as an actor for many, many years, because it's hard, and there's it's hard to enter different psychologies, and it's also just a hard industry, and so you have to find a way to sustain yourself if you want a long career.
I'm happy to say that I'm working with HelloFresh again. Since my province is still in lockdown, it's been difficult to keep up some semblance of normalcy. Recently, I found that cooking dinner is one of those rituals that really keeps you grounded, but since I'm so busy at the moment, it's hard to find time to go to the grocery store, which is why HelloFresh is such a lifesaver. It allows me to keep on track during the day while still offering that moment of respite in the evenings. Just me and the food. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit service, which makes cooking easy, fun, and affordable. I've been trying to eat less meat recently, but it's pretty difficult to transition to a well-rounded vegetarian diet. HelloFresh is super helpful with that since they offer simple and hearty vegetarian and pescatarian options every week. According to the Time Institute, an average trip to the grocery store takes 41 minutes. But with HelloFresh, you can save time and get everything you need to make chef-curated meals delivered straight to your door. My toxic trait is that I'm really bad at shopping for produce and often find myself having to compost rotten food. The amazing thing about HelloFresh is that it encourages sustainable eating, since they offer pre-portioned ingredients. The packaging used to ship the food is made from recyclable and/or already recycled content, and there's no worry about commitment because you can easily change your delivery days or food preferences and skip a week whenever you need to. Amidst the pandemic, HelloFresh is committed to giving back by taking extra steps to keep their employees and customers safe and donating over 4 million meals to charity in 2020. So go to HelloFresh.com and use my code BROE12 to get 12 free meals including free shipping. That's HelloFresh.com with the code BROE12 to get 12 free meals including free shipping. Special thank you to Louis Osta, Syed Hassan, Malpertui, Izzy, DW, Cooper Stimpson, Nina E., James Barcelona, Tenzing Mingmar, Greg Peter, Jessica, Nadia C., Sean Bay, and Emerson Ross for supporting this channel.